to say thank you to Impact Silver Spring for the opportunity to present to you on a subject that I hold very dear. Um, uh, Thank you specifically to Rudy Logan, who was the first to reach out to me about this presentation, and to Lanita Whitehurst and Yesenia Regalado. Um, I'd also like to recognize, this is as I see a couple of familiar names in here. None the least of which is my mother and my father are on the presentation tonight, and they're actually part of what is being presented tonight. And good college friend, Damon Lombard from Morehouse College days, and a special shout out to my students from Coppin State University, who, for whom this is actually the subject of tonight's presentation is part of the overall topic of our class for this semester. I'm teaching a course called Race, Housing, and Community. So what I want to do first is I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a slideshow prepared for you. And okay. So my East County home. What we're looking at tonight here is a discussion on strategies for overcoming discrimination in the housing market in Montgomery County. For this presentation, I'm focusing on the experiences of 3 African-American families searching for homes generally between 1958 and 1968. These stories converge in what is known as the Tamarack Triangle community of Colesville. And each of these stories represents a different angle or strategy used by African Americans who are trying to find homes and overcome discrimination in a largely segregated housing market. The factors relevant here that we're going to explore are the impact of the presence of older African American communities, the impact of advances in housing legislation, and also the impacts and reactions to racial steering. Additionally, in this presentation, I'm going to talk about some early efforts in Tamarack Triangle neighborhood, where Black and white homeowners banded together to create a stable, integrated community and fight against the negative forces of racial steering and potential block busting. The Tamarack Triangle. I assume some on the call are very familiar with it. This is where I grew up. I grew up on Tamarack Road. That's the only house I knew until the time I was 18 and I was driven off to college. Tamarack Triangle is part of the community of Colesville, Maryland. Though I have to admit, growing up, I never really told anybody I was from Colesville because we all kind of identified more with Silver Spring, I think, just because that was our mailing address. But the new houses in the suburban sprawl hit the Colesville area more so around in the early 1960s, and that's when the Tamarack community was built. And I believe the house that my parents purchased in 1966 was originally built in 1963. That neighborhood came to comprise roughly about 846 houses. And at that time, this is a wonderful price. At that time, you could purchase a home for the $20,000 range. So for those who are not necessarily familiar with the neighborhood, just show a little regional map. We have Silver Spring down here right on top of Washington, D.C. And if you follow my arrow and go down the road to down Route 29, I have Colesville encircled here. So Colesville still uses, I assume still to this day, still uses a Silver Spring mailing address, but it's about as far as you can get while you're still using a Silver Spring mailing address. A little bit closer in on the map, we have the heart of Colesville, which I characterize the heart of Colesville as the crossroads, that intersection where East Randolph Road intersects with New Hampshire Avenue. That's right here at this rectangle. To the east of that, and the circle is the area we call Tamarack Triangle. And to get a little closer, this is the triangle itself. It's not a perfect triangle, of course, but it's a triangle enough to use the term. You see in this particular map, I pulled these off of Google Maps. These in this map, they show several businesses like Bodies and Backs Therapeutic Massage. This is a completely residential area. These are just businesses that I assume people have registered to their home address. But this is the Tamarack Triangle. And this is a picture of a typical house that you might find in Tamarack. You know, one thing I like about these pictures is I was looking at them. I didn't take them specifically for this purpose, but as I was looking at them, I was looking at the way that people care for their homes and what that says about a community where people have settled in for the long term and have made additions onto their homes, have made investments into their house. That means they really see this as a place that's stable, that's a good investment, that's something they want to hold on to. And so just as I look through these pictures, homes in Tamarack Triangle did not come with double wide driveways. This is something somebody added on later. Or if you can see this behind the tree here, it's not the best picture, but someone added a double carport onto their home. Or this one right here, someone changed the entire facade of their home and made a stone facade. And this house is one of my favorites also. They've added a porch. The house did not originally come with a porch. Now, these houses at the time they were built were considerable improvements on the quality and type of housing available in the county generally at that time. But now, given the kind of houses that people build that you see on HGTV, these houses do not have the garden tubs. They don't have the big walk-in closets, all those amenities that middle and upper class folks are shown through HGTV as the ideal. But these were still very quality homes. And they have risen in value with the appreciation of value in the DC area at large. So my interest in the community beyond having grown up there, my interest looking at the history of the community really goes back to exploration that I was doing in the context of my dissertation research. In 2004, I published a dissertation called African American Schoolhouses, Community, History, and Reclamation. For that project, I was looking at Rosenwald schools and contemporary communities where individuals had banded together and formed nonprofit groups in order to preserve or historically rehabilitate their dilapidating schoolhouses. These were segregation era schoolhouses built through the Rosenwald Fund, which was a partnership between Julius Rosenwald, who was the Sears CEO at the time, and Booker T. Washington. The Rosenwald Fund existed roughly between 1915 and 1932 or so. And that fund was responsible for helping to spur the building of several thousand schools throughout the southeastern United States. So I believe both of my parents who are from South Carolina and went to these little one-room segregated schoolhouses went to Rosenwald schools in their respective communities. I also think that Montgomery County has approximately 7 of these Rosenwald school buildings. I'm not sure how many are still standing, but one of them was the old Smithville Colored School. So for my project, I did a comparative analysis of community groups involved in renovating these schoolhouses, one in Florida. And because this one was one I knew about, and the chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated in Montgomery County was actually actively engaged in this project, and I was a member, I went ahead and included this in the study. So the building has been renovated now, and it's been utilized by the fraternity for several years. But this is a picture of the time period when it was being worked on. Now, in that effort of learning about the school and working with the community group, that the Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated chapter in Montgomery County, Iota Upsilon Lambda. And in that effort, I found out more about the community of Smithville that school represented. Smithville was an African-American farming community that existed in that eastern portion of what we call Colesville. Its origins are with a gentleman named George Smith, who was able to purchase land from his former owner, Dr. Washington Duval. Somebody might have seen the sign for a neighborhood called Duval Oaks off of Randolph Road. Additional members, family members came and purchased land also, members of the Johnson, Jackson, and Warner families. And initially this community was called Smithtown, eventually Smith Village, and later it was known as Smithville. But this was a family-oriented community. One particular author, Sidney Nathans, referred to these types of segregation era family-oriented landowning Black communities as fortresses without walls. And what he's getting at there is the independence that these communities made possible, the kind of collaboration and cooperation in a family-oriented atmosphere was kind of made a fortress in the midst of a larger hostile Jim Crow environment, a place where you could raise your children and protect them from that hostility. And that's the kind of community that Smithville was. With my knowledge of the community of Tamarack Triangle, I was fascinated to learn about the history of Smithville and how that particular community actually was, that's the very land where portions of Tamarack Triangle exist now. And I was interested to explore ways and to figure out how Smithville influenced the development of the diverse community of Tamarack Triangle. You know, growing up in Montgomery County, I think there's a level of diversity that you're comfortable with that you kind of end up taking for granted until you go elsewhere. When I left Montgomery County, I went down to Atlanta, Georgia, and then I went to Tampa, Florida. In both of those places, I found myself looking for places to live, and just realizing and experiencing for the first time how segregated living conditions were in other portions of the country, not the kind of diverse community that I took for granted. And looking at Smithville also, I wanted to explore how this case study confirms, contradicts, or adds to existing research on African-American suburbanization. That's something that I found myself interested into, looking at the broader trends and stories of suburbanization in general and African-American suburbanization in particular. I got involved for a while with the Center for Suburban Studies at Hofstra University. And I wanted to see where Tamarack Triangle fell in the context of what I was learning. So for this particular project, I decided to focus on African-American pioneers in the community. Now by pioneers, what I mean are the earliest African-Americans to come and purchase the newly constructed homes that were becoming the Tamarack Triangle. Individuals who moved out generally from the Washington, D.C. area or from within Washington, D.C. to purchase a home in the suburbs in the early 1960s. Specifically, I was interested in investigating their strategies for overcoming discrimination in the housing market. Also interested in the extent of their participation as placemakers in the community. Now, placemakers, what I mean by that, individuals who are in the community from its inception and are part of actually building and forming the community institutions, not individuals who come later and are, in a sense, add-ons to an already existing community, but placemakers are people who are there, who are building the community. The community institutions in this particular example, or this particular case study, would be the Tamarack Triangle Civic Association and also the William Tyler Page Elementary School Parent-Teacher Association. Another thing that's very important here, I was very interested in understanding what these pioneers think looking back. You know, we've got over 50 years now where we can look back and see what were the benefits, what were the broader benefits, what were the family level benefits of this migration to the suburbs. I almost forgot. Let me have one thing I meant to say. I mentioned William Tyler Page Elementary School. I need to announce the fact that I'm a proud 1991 graduate of Paint Branch High School, also Montgomery County's own. So for my project, I've interviewed 3 families: the Floods, the Klughs. I knew where to find the Klughs, and the Coltons. Regarding these names, the names here are aliases. These are pseudonyms. The Klughs, those are my parents, and they have their full permission to utilize their names, and they're on the presentation, and they're free to correct me, castigate me if I say something wrong. But the Floods and the Coltons, there are no secrets here. But the fact is, I would need to contact their family to feel comfortable just putting their name on blast. Mr. Flood and Mr. Colton, unfortunately, we lost both of them in the past couple of years. These were amazing individuals that I grew up knowing my entire life, but their stories are significant for what I want to talk about here tonight. So Mr. and Mrs. Flood, they came out a little earlier. They started their search around 1957. Mr. Flood was an architect. Mrs. Flood was an art teacher in DC public schools. I see them as both very creative type of folks. They both went to Howard University, and they wanted to build and design their own home. So this was their American dream. They targeted Montgomery County. And the interview was interesting. Mr. Flood said something that none of the other interviewees mentioned, and I guess this is because of his background in architecture. But he mentioned the land quality. He said that portions of Prince George's County were lower land, and you'd have to deal with some of the water issues a little bit more. I'm sure that's not characteristic of all of Prince George's County. Prince George's County is huge. But evidently, this portion of Montgomery County has decent land quality. And they also, for their home search, they focused on existing semi-rural Black communities. They weren't coming out looking at the new construction that was being built. They wanted to build their own home, but part of that was also because they didn't see that as a choice. As this quote says, Ms. Flood in the interview stated, at that time, the concrete understanding everywhere was that if you wanted to buy land in Montgomery County, you had to buy it from a Black family, that whites would not sell it to you, which was quite true. So it was not a possibility. So they looked around the community, focusing on these Black semi-rural enclaves that existed, such as Smithville, or community that they mentioned further up in Burtonsville, or the Sandy Spring era. Regarding this, Mr. Flood said, we'd ask people where they live. Where did the Black people live? We'd go to Spencerville. We'd go out in Sandy Spring and then up in Burtonsville off a little road up there where we had a friend who had bought land. We looked up there and that didn't quite set with us. We were trying to find something not as rural as anything we'd seen. So then one day we just happened to see in the paper an advertisement for land for sale in Colesville. And because they knew the area, they knew that that particular land was in Smithville specifically. So in 1958, they came out and paid Kermit and Beatrice Trigg $2,500 for a little over 1/2 acre of land. Now, Kermit and Beatrice Trigg were individuals who had decided that what they wanted to do was sell land to African Americans who wanted to come buy land to build a house, because they observed the fact that Blacks were being turned away from so many other communities in the area. They wanted to make a space where people could actually have something of their own. They had to overcome some obstacles in terms of financing this dream. They were not able to get a loan from the bank, even though they're educated people, they're making decent salaries at the time. But they ended up having to turn to their church to procure a $500 loan for the down payment. And then they turned to a local African-American builder to build the house. A gentleman named Robert Hill, known as Bob Hill, owned the Sandy Spring Construction Company. And he was known for building quality homes in the area. I believe there's over 250 or so homes that he has built in the area. Generally, these are brick homes, still standing. You can still see the visible characteristics of a Bob Hill home in portions of Montgomery County. So they designed that house, Robert Hill built it, and the house was finished and they moved in 1963. So the Floods live in a portion of the neighborhood called BK Acres. Now, BK Acres is named after Beatrice and Kermit Trigg, who sold the people in this area of the community the land to build their houses. So this is on the western tip of the triangle where Fairland Road meets Randolph Road. This is BK Acres. I think about them as a young couple with these dreams coming out in this community to basically build their future. I like this quote from the interview where Mr. Flood said, you know, we moved in '63, but all that time we would come out here fairly often because things like the brick right here on this wall, we were sitting in this house as we were doing this interview. Those were bricks that were being thrown away by a company, and I would load them into the car and bring them out here and stack them back in the back. I didn't know how I was going to use them, but I knew they were beautiful concrete block brick. And so we were saving those. There were some other test cylinders that we have a retaining wall made of. So we would come out often just to see the land and sit and watch the stars. That was somewhere around 63 years ago that they began doing that. And I hope that everything worked out just like they wanted. At first, however, they did have some issues to contend with. They were moving out in the area in 1963, where there was still some racial animosity. That's characterized in the quote from Mr. Flood. He said, the place out here was very conservative when we came here. Just riding out here was not a pleasant experience. The little meadow farms, well, that area, and Mrs. Flood broke in, that was Klan country. She said that there was great resentment about the fact that middle-class people who were Black were moving into the area. They specifically talked about the Meadowwood Shopping Center, Meadow Farms, I believe it's called. I think that shopping center is still there, but of course, a different demographic now. They talked about some of the troubling experiences that their children had at Colesville Elementary School. This was before William Tyler Page Elementary School was built. But before the child got out of elementary school, they built Page Elementary School, and the student was able to transfer and had a much better experience at Page because of the diversity there. As some of the first individuals to move into Tamarack Triangle, even while the larger portion of the community was still just being built, they formed a literal and figurative bridge between the older community and the new community. They got to know and socialize with individuals who were still part of the Smithville community, would go to fish fries with them. They also became the first Black members of the neighborhood tennis and swim club. I believe it's called Twin Farms. They also were part of the group that started the Tamarack Triangle Civic Association, the TTCA. Another thing in terms of countywide activity that's important to notice, in the interview, Mrs. Flood talked about her efforts regarding a group called Action in Montgomery County, or AIM for short. Now this group was one that she formed back in somewhere around the mid-1960s as a way to jumpstart civil rights activity in the county. And the goal was to increase the number of Black teachers and Black principals who were hired, and also to get Black folks onto the school board. They were instrumental in helping to elect James Pat Doherty to the school board. That was the first African-American on the school board in Montgomery County, a decorated veteran. Also, individuals like Roscoe Nix, for whom an elementary school in Montgomery County, I believe, is named after Roscoe Nix now, and also an individual named Odessa Shannon. My understanding is there is a contemporary organization in Montgomery County that actually has the same name, Action in Montgomery County, but I want to make sure that people understand that this was something different. Mrs. Flood's vision for AIM was an organization that was to jumpstart civil rights activity and have some victories, but at the same time, she was not creating an organization that was intended to last forever. She said, well, this would be a 5-year effort. She told everybody at the beginning, this was going to be a 5-year effort. And after 5 years, she sent everybody a letter and said that the organization was being dissolved. So this was a completely different group called Action in Montgomery County. Now to move on to two of my favorite people, Mr. and Mrs. Klugh. They came out a few years after the floods, but there's some critical differences specifically related to legislation that occurred between when they started looking for a home and when the floods were looking for a home. So Mr. and Mrs. Klugh lived in Washington, D.C. They were graduates of, or they are graduates of South Carolina State College, now South Carolina State University. Mr. Klugh at the time was working as a computer programmer at the Naval Observatory. To my knowledge, the second African-American to work in a professional capacity at that facility. Mrs. Klugh at the time was a nutrition specialist at the Agricultural Research Center in Beltsville. And they began searching for a home in 1965. A quote from Mr. Klugh. He said, "We had recently got married, and we knew at the time we did not want to continue living in an apartment because we were both raised in homes. So we stayed in that apartment for about 2 years, and we saved as much money as we could to buy a home. Montgomery County was known to have excellent schools rated near the top. It was interesting for me to learn that the schools are rated that high that far back, not only in the state of Maryland, but in the country, much higher than in DC and Prince George's County at the time. Although we didn't have any children at the time, our plan was to have children. So we wanted to be in an environment that we thought would be best for them. That was the main reason. And it just looked like a nice place to live. It was a beautiful place. We liked the area. It was fairly close to both of our jobs. And it was known to be a low crime area, just a good place to live." What the simple motivations that motivate most individuals young couples looking to purchase a home. For them though, their search was contextualized within the era of what we call the civil rights movement. They were very interested in working to further the progress of civil rights. They were aware of recent progress and recent civil rights decisions. In particular, in 1962, saw Kennedy's Executive Order 11063, Equal Opportunity in Housing. And this order made it illegal to discriminate on federal properties or federally funded housing. Also, just recently, there had been the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So they saw the momentum. This must have been quite an amazing time to be a civil rights minded individual. They were also aware in the county of at least two families that had successfully integrated new housing development. So they saw this as something that they could do. They saw other people do it. And they were just simply undaunted by racial tensions. They saw their housing search as their own personal way to engage in civil rights protest. This quote here exemplifies this spirit where Mr. Klugh says, "Well, we just figured somebody would have to be first. Maybe we were too young to be intimidated. We were both in our 20s at the time, and we knew what we wanted, and we were determined. We just felt that nothing was going to stop us." So when they came out to the area, they had settled on the general Colesville area because that was the spot that was most convenient for both of their jobs, and that's where a lot of the new housing was being built at the time. They found some initial incidents of discrimination. The Kimblewick neighborhood, they went there and they were turned away. Kimblewick, I believe that's closer to western Colesville, where Galway Elementary School is, that neighborhood. Calverton, and they were also initially turned down in a portion of Tamarack Triangle called Paint Branch Estates, kind of where Tamarack Road meets East Randolph Road. Regarding that, Mr. Klugh said, there were some houses down in Kimblewick that we liked very much, and the real estate person was very reluctant to talk about it. I asked her, I said, "You must have a problem." I said, "Are they telling you that you can't sell to Blacks in this area?" And she finally said, "Yes, I'm told I can't sell to Blacks." And it seemed like it was hurting her to say that, but she just told me that. Another thing that would happen is when, instead of just being directly turned away, Mrs. Klugh says many times we would go to the houses, we'd ask people about the price, and the person selling the house, instead of just telling them the price, would say, "Well, I have to ask my neighbor." The question is, well, who's selling the house, right? You were the neighbor. But they're basically saying they have to ask their neighbor if they think it's okay for them to sell to a person of color. So the Klughs were undeterred by that, and that just emboldened them and made them more determined to be successful in this journey. And eventually they were able to become the second Black family on Tamarack Road. They were able to do this because they went first with Suburban Maryland Fair Housing Incorporated. Suburban Maryland Fair Housing was an organization that was helping to integrate the housing developments. And they went around with a test couple, those older white couple. And so the four of them would go home shopping. The Klughs would go in. If they got turned away, then they go back. Then the older white couple would go in and see what they were told differently, and basically catch people red-handed in the act of discriminating. They tell the Black family that there weren't any homes available, and then they roll out the red carpet for the older white couple and tell them about all the models that were available. Eventually, it was this couple who was involved in Suburban Maryland Fair Housing Incorporated that alerted the Klughs to an advertisement on a Walter Reed Army Medical Center bulletin board. Now, see, because of that executive order, if you advertised on the bulletin board at the federal facility at the Army Medical Center, you weren't supposed to be discriminating. So they were able to find that advertisement for a home on Tamarack Road that was being sold by a medical doctor at Walter Reed who was being transferred. So that's how they become the second Black family on Tamarack Road. Now you can imagine this was a turbulent time in America. You know, read much about the activity that went on in the 60s, and they had some initial concerns because they had heard of a cross being burned on the lawn and shots being fired into the home of a Black family less than 3 miles away. So I said, when a friend offered to let Mr. Klugh borrow a gun for the first few nights, he accepted, but fortunately did not have to use it in any kind of way, shape, or form. They also found out that one of the new neighbors let them know that when they moved into the house, before they moved into the house, there was a neighbor who tried to start a petition to get everybody together in agreement that they would not let a Black family move into the neighborhood. The good news, I mean, it's not great to learn that your new next door neighbor is somebody who tried to start a petition to keep you out. But the great news about it was that nobody would sign it. These individuals were not interested in upholding these segregationist situations. So they settled into the neighborhood. They became active in the Page Elementary School PTA and the Tamarack Triangle Civic Association, and also became part of the Civic Association's Human Relations Committee, which was formed to combat some of the racial steering and blockbusting tactics that went on in the area. Now, regarding the racial steering and blockbusting, I'm going to talk about that in the context of my conversation with Mr. Colton. Mr. Colton was born and raised in the Sandy Spring community that's not far away from Smithville. Sandy Spring is a great community with its own history. During slavery, it was a free Black community, originally founded, I believe, by Quakers, who were the ones who freed their African-American slaves, and individuals were able to form their own fortress without walls in Sandy Spring. And there's a Sandy Spring Slave Museum individuals can visit, I guess, on the internet now, or once this pandemic is over, you can actually go and leave a donation. Mr. Colton worked in real estate and later for the federal government. And he moved to Colesville in 1967, moved to the neighborhood in 1967. The Klughs had moved in 1966. Remember, the Floods had moved in 1963, though they originally purchased in 1958. So Mr. Colton moved into a place called Colesville Estates, which is part of Tamarack Triangle. Now, to show you on the map, the western tip of the triangle is where BK Drive is. This is where the Floods lived. This is where Beatrice and Kermit Trigg sold land specifically to African-American families who wanted to buy land to build a house. Near the bottom of the screen, to 5 o'clock of the circle, you see Smith Village Road. And this is an area where individuals who are related to the community of Smithville still owned land and homes. This was still a place where people had a few farmhouses. So this particular portion of the neighborhood, which is encircled, was going to be embedded between two Black enclaves. So perhaps that's the reason why the builders decided to steer African Americans specifically to that spot. When I was growing up, that particular part of Tamarack Triangle was completely Black with the exception of one white family. And I'd heard some older folks from Tamarack refer to that area, say they used to call it Little Africa. I don't remember being too curious about it, but it was certainly noticeable. And I always used to kind of wonder, why did so many Black people choose to go live in that one particular spot of the neighborhood? Like, how did that happen? But I didn't understand the term racial steering at that time. But the racial steering that occurred is explained in this quote by Mr. Colton. He said, "These were brand new houses. We moved here in 66, 67. I moved here with the beginning group. I think the real estate company did it by design because the two model houses were on both sides of me. And I would see whites coming in and spend 10 to 15 minutes and leave. I'd see Blacks come in, they'd spend 30 minutes to an hour, and then about a month later, you'd see a moving van coming. So I think the broker guided the whites out and the Blacks in. So there was about 80 houses at the time in Colesville Estates. It was all Black. So they had a cohesive community. They even talked about the fact that some individuals, some of the wives in the community formed a group called the Ladies of Colesville Estates. And there was basically like a welcome wagon, a welcome committee that would greet new residents. Now, in terms of the racial steering and kind of the negative elements of that and what we call blockbusting, there seemed to be the inclination, or Mr. Colton remembered hearing that the plan was potentially to flip the rest of Tamarack from white to Black and send everybody there moving over to Calverton. And that will be racial turnover. That will be a way that unscrupulous realtors could make a lot of money by inspiring white flight, so people would sell their homes for less than they're worth, and then turn around and sell those same homes to Black families for perhaps more than they're worth, because Blacks were limited in where they could buy because of discrimination. And concerning this, he knew about it. In this quote, he says, "Turnover and blockbusting. See, I sold real estate in Washington and I knew how to do it. We do that in Washington. We'd go into a block, buy a house, sell it to a Black person. Then you'd go right through the block and you'd say," it was a code language, you'd say, "I sold whatever address. Would you like to sell your house while you can still get a good price for it?" That means the Blacks were moving in. And some of the things that realtors would do was leave a sold sign up just for weeks at a time, and also just knock around unsolicited to doors and letting everybody know that the house was sold to somebody of color, and that coded language saying you want to sell your house while you can still get some money for it. But the thing about it was, this particular community was full of individuals that Mrs. Flood characterized as individuals of a different stripe. They were not interested in falling prey to the tactics of realtors who wanted to engage in blockbusting. They were individuals who were more of a civil rights minded generation, who valued the idea of living in an integrated setting. And as a result, there were individuals who banded together within the context of that Tamarack Triangle Civic Association, specifically that Human Relations Committee, and they implemented something called living room discussion groups, living room discussions. These are implemented in the early 1970s. These were actually, it was not just a group of neighbors getting together and talking in someone's living room. This was a planned activity. One gentleman, I believe his name is Dr. Bert Phillips. I've not talked with him in many years. I believe he still lives in Tamarack Triangle. He's a sociologist, and he had a company where he did diversity training with the federal government. And he actually trained the volunteer coordinators in how to conduct these living room discussion groups. So there was a planned activity with approximately 6 sessions. And so they had these, I guess they were organized on a block by block basis. Some of the interview comments, from this particular activity, one person mentioned, she said, it helped tremendously. People were very often open with their feelings and comments. And we were able to rid ourselves of some of the stereotypes that were not true of all people, because the races really didn't socialize that much together. You didn't do anything social with each other. You didn't really know that much about each other. You just assumed this and assumed that. So I thought it was an excellent thing. The same individual went on to say, topics covered were, like, for instance, one of those meetings, one of the men told one of the white ladies there that, yeah, I used to think that all whites were so pristine, and I didn't even think that they ever needed to wear deodorant. It was just so funny and really so good, I mean, they were very open. It was just an open discussion and airing of a lot of things like that, which was good. A lot of laughing went on, a lot of hugging, and people feeling comfortable. And that's really important, because you think about the context of the time. We're talking in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when these living room discussion groups were going on. And for many of the individuals at that time, this was the first time living in a significantly integrated setting. And they did need to get to know each other and build bonds and move on from those old misguided stereotypes that they might have been fed at some point along the way when they were growing up. So that living room discussion group effort helped to create a strong community where individuals who were also pretty savvy about their investments and about the politics of the time were able to recognize what was going on when realtors tried to come in and do a little racial steering and blockbusting and so forth. And instead of accepting that what they did was they got together and wrote a letter and sent these letters to local realtors and said, quite frankly, if you continue this, we will, as a whole community, we will boycott you. We will not utilize your services. And they actually physically went down to offices and let people know that they weren't going to accept this in their community. So the long-term implications of that particular type of activity. Richard Rothstein wrote a seminal book on housing segregation. It's called The Color of Law, that I suggest everybody pick up. It's something that it's a subject matter that we all need to be conversant about if we want to understand the political and economic realities that we exist in today. One of the things he said in the NPR segment here is, he said, today, Black wealth is 5% of white wealth, 5%. Black income is 60% of white income. So the issue is not so much, 60% is still an issue, but 5% of white wealth is alarming. So that we have really a wealth challenge more so than an income challenge. In Tamarack Triangle, however, you had homes that originally sold in the 20,000 range that can now sell for as much as $500,000. I just went on Zillow and I was looking at the price estimates. And I know Zillow is not any exact thing about what the price would actually be if the house was sold. But this is just the heart of Tamarack Triangle is the William Tyler Page Elementary School, the building over here on the top left of the screen. And this is just a snapshot, a screenshot of what Zillow gives as prices for the homes in the neighborhood, or the valuation of homes in the neighborhood currently. So that's a significant investment. I don't know how to make that much money off of $20,000 unless I get in on the next GameStop thing. But I usually somehow find out about those things after the fact instead of being one of those who gets in on the front end. But beyond the very real economic impact and what that means for the growth of wealth for families in this community, and specifically the African-American community families who were able to come and live in this community and establish homes for themselves and realize that appreciation over time. There's also that the very real sentimental or like people-oriented ties that were built by a strong neighborhood. And you see that exemplified today. If you go on Facebook and type in Tamarack Triangle, there are different groups. There's Tamarack Triangle Neighborhood Reunion. There's a William Tyler WT Page in the 80s group. And there's more groups than that. But people have gotten together through Facebook and kept those community bonds alive, because this area tends to be a little bit transient. And also individuals have grown up and moved other places in the country. But so even though you go to Tamarack Triangle now and there might be a lot of unfamiliar faces, there is still a Tamarack Triangle that exists as an imagined community via Facebook. And people still do have literal reunions for Tamarack Triangle. There's more than one set of reunions that occur based upon the age group that someone is in. So there's long-term implications of what it means to build a stable community. It's exemplified by this quote by a gentleman named Gary Orfield. He said, "Communities that preserve stable integration and offer assurance of relative stability are no longer seen as places to flee because of predictable decline, but as places in which investment is far more secure than other areas in the path of expanding minority populations." So Tim, I'm proud to say that the neighborhood where I come from is one that exemplifies this quote. And I'm really appreciative of the fact that so many individuals got together and worked to make that a strong community. Growing up there, I took a lot for granted. I did not know the groundwork that went on to make the reality that I experienced occur. But this is what I've since learned as an adult, and also living in another community now. I understand that community takes work. And I'm appreciative for those who laid that groundwork for Tamarack Triangle communities and other communities like it. That's my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Dr. Klugh. Yeah, I see some hand clapping. Yeah, it's fantastic. And this is actually my second time hearing the presentation, and it's just as interesting the second time through. And so thank you so much for sharing your research and your personal experiences to help bring Tamarack Triangle and East County alive. I think just the sheer number of people that we have on our call here tonight shows the amount of interest that people have in this topic. And so we just want to share, so we have maybe 20, 25 minutes for some question and answer. And so the way that we're going to do this is, if you will type questions in the chat, the questions will come to the hosts. And so, so not only questions, if you have questions, comments, appreciations, if you'll put them in the chat, Yesenia and I are going to be monitoring the chat, and we'll share the questions, comments, appreciations. So let me see. So I see one question is, how would I get SSL hours? And I'm going to let Yesenia answer that question.
Yes, I'll put my email in the chat again. And so you'll just email me and I will send you the form and it's signed.
And so any questions for Dr. Klugh? As I said, questions, comments, appreciations?
I thought it was a brilliant presentation. Thank you for being so thoughtful and bringing so much of yourself to this wonderful conversation.
I appreciate you. Thank you very much.
So I have a question here from Jane Lyons, who says, great presentation. Have the homes in this part of the county appreciated at the same rate as similar homes in other parts of the county?
I cannot answer that with certainty, but I do not think so. It just depends where you're talking about. If you're talking about Western Montgomery County, I believe homes appreciated there a little bit more. Homes might have been originally 35,000. Just hearing my parents talk about it, some of the neighborhoods that they were turned away from, the houses might have been a little bit more, $30,000, $35,000, even $40,000. But now some of those homes, you're talking about $800,000, to $1 million. So some areas of the county have grown in value more, but Tamarack Triangle is still appreciated significantly.
And so we have a question here from
Lanita,
Mhm.
I can't see any of them because it's the host only.
Oh, okay, that's
So I
fine.
can't read any of the affirmations.
Okay, no worries. So a couple of folks here, great presentation from Angie and Stephanie, but another question here from Anne. What is the thing that most surprised you about doing your research?
Well, I guess a couple of things. You know, I always love when I get a chance to do research while I'm doing interviews and learning about people's experiences. And so in this particular case, these were individuals that I knew of, but didn't really know that well. Now, these were people who were respected elders in the community, and names that I'd heard my parents mentioning. But I didn't know how pivotal they were in laying the foundation, such as Mrs. Flood and her activity to do the organizing to be able to get Odessa Shannon and Roscoe Nix on the school board. I knew Odessa Shannon and I knew Roscoe Nix, but I didn't know that either of them had ever even served on the school board, because I believe that happened when I was a very small child, and I wasn't, as a child growing up, you're not aware of who's on the school board or the significance of the school board and those types of things. Also, it was interesting hearing the stories of the community, the kind of racism that they encountered in like Colesville, right in the area they call the Smith's Esso, I guess was the gas station on the corner of New Hampshire and Randolph, where there's a gas station there today. But it was hard just kind of picturing the landscape at the time and what it would have been like to be there and experience the personalities present at that particular point versus what I was familiar with.
So Bryce says, thank you. We just moved to Tamarack Triangle, so it's really interesting to learn the history. Mike shares your appreciation for the book, The Color of Law, and he asks, where can we read more on the discriminatory policies in Montgomery County or Maryland?
Maryland specific, a book I just finally got around to getting through. It's an excellent book. It's more of a Baltimore specific book, but it does give you a good overview of the issues we're talking about in terms of discrimination, whether it be racial covenants or attempts to actually impose segregation via legislation or redlining and so forth. Book by Antero Piatella called Not in My Neighborhood. That's a great work. It's a good read. And that is Baltimore specific and goes into not just segregation as it played out for housing in the African American community, but also in the Jewish community, and talked about how basically there was not a dual housing market in Baltimore, but there was basically a threefold housing market when it came to segregation. That was pretty enlightening to me to understand how the history of housing segregation as it affected Jewish communities. I don't know offhand of anything in terms specifically about housing segregation in Montgomery County. I have to admit, this was research interviews that I did roughly about 2008 to 2010. And I've since gotten very invested into a project regarding the preservation of a African-American cemetery in Baltimore, and I've gotten deeper into my heritage research. But I can investigate and maybe make some resources available.
And if you can do that, Dr. Klugh, we will make sure to get that information to people. So Rachna says a big thank you to your parents for sharing their story. Kimberly says, great presentation. A question here from David. How did your parents get connected with suburban Maryland fair housing? And can you explain a little more about their journey from testers to home buyers?
That's a good question. How did they get involved with these folks? That is something that I can't really recall that right this second. If my mom wants to put it in the chat, I'll certainly read it to you. But it was that particular couple that they were going around with were the ones that showed. They were also monitoring the bulletin boards at the federal facilities because they knew that homes posted on those boards were homes where there was not supposed to be discrimination taking place. So I guess concurrently, while the efforts were going around in terms of being testers, there was also an effort to monitor the bulletin boards. And since the couple knew that they were specifically looking at that neighborhood, Tamarack Triangle, they'd already been there and been turned away from a house in a portion of that neighborhood. When they saw it on the bulletin board, they went straight to my parents with it. And that was what they wanted. And they were able to settle on they were able to assume the person's loan as opposed to having to go out and get their own. They bought that house. It was supposed to be their starter house, they said. I find that funny because they've been in that house for about 54 years now or so. So I guess they're still getting started.
Great, thank you. So Molly says, thank you. This was fabulous. She's wondering if you knew Ruby Rubens, who did a lot for fair housing in Montgomery County. She was a person who taught many of us about the housing inequity in the county. So a question about whether you know Ruby Rubens.
That is one of these names that I've grown up hearing, but I don't know her personally. I'm sure that my folks do, but I don't know her personally. I don't think she's someone I've ever actually met. But in the discussion of fair housing, her name was mentioned.
Great. And so a question about the current demographics of the neighborhood. Did it stay integrated or change over time?
That's interesting. That's an interesting question. So the area is it's still a very integrated neighborhood, but it's got much more internationalized, I would say. I'd have to look at the overall demographic trends of the county to really put this in context. But growing up, mostly it was more so a white-black dynamic, majority white. You go into elementary school, and there was the majority of children at the school were white students, and there was but a good proportion of black students, maybe 25, 30%. And you may have had one or two Latino or Hispanic or Asian children, but now you have a lot of immigrants who've come into the area. So there's a heavy African population in the Tamarack Triangle. I believe this, I'm not sure about the school, but I think the school is not a majority white school anymore. So essentially you have a much more heavy Hispanic population in the area too. So when I go into the neighborhood, it's still a very integrated neighborhood, but the dynamics have shifted in a visible way that people of color, I believe, are, if not a majority of the neighborhood, they're soon to be a majority of the neighborhood. And many of those people of color are individuals who are first or second generation immigrants from other countries, not just migrants from the South like my parents from South Carolina. But and I remember in the interview with Mr. Colton, he talked about that too, and he really took pride in that because he related that directly to their efforts to stabilize, to create a stable, integrated community. And he said he welcomed individuals and was glad he was part of creating a community where they felt welcome to come live. And so he saw that as an extension of the impact that they made possible.
And so Dr. Klugh, Tia asked, does Montgomery County have this history archived? And if so, what department would retain this kind of information?
Well, these are more, the interviews I did were, I guess, not so much oral history interviews. If it was an oral history interview, that would mean I would have given them to the archives. They were more in the context of ethnographic field work within anthropology, cultural anthropology. So I have not, but I have thought about that. And reading these interviews again, there's a lot of good information that is beyond what I included in this conversation that I do think would be great to give to the Montgomery County Historical Society, but I will need to clean them up and vet them through the children of the individuals that I interviewed, because they're talking about their families and they do name the children and so forth. And but I don't see any real obstacle to getting this information to be in the archives and available. There are some interesting good sources about Colesville that have been written over the years, though. Maybe a little dated, but I know Ned Bailey wrote a book, A History of Colesville, right, that I use as a resource. And another book in my references here, Northeastern Montgomery County Black Oral History Study. You've had individuals like Warwick Hill from the Sandy Spring community who wrote a book on history of Black education in the county called Before Us Lies the Timber. And there's another book that deals with education that I cannot recall right now, but it's one of those that I could make available in a kind of a listing of potential sources in the future.
Great. And so let me just say we have a ton of questions. Okay, so we'll keep plowing through. So this is going to be kind of a two-part. I'm going to combine some questions here. So one person asked, how widespread was discrimination in housing for African Americans? And sort of adding to that, Jennifer asks, I've heard of higher water hookup prices or building permit fees when the families were building houses in that area. Was there discrimination from the county government? So how wide was the discrimination, and was there discrimination from the county government?
Last thing, something that we did not discuss that. That's not something that came up. I've not heard that before. That would be interesting to explore. And as far as the widespread nature of the discrimination, it was interesting. I think a lot of neighborhoods were going through a similar thing at the same time in Montgomery County, where individuals like my parents were coming in and being able to purchase homes. So just over the 60s, you had really a lot of areas opening up, but they were opening up because people were applying that pressure. Like I said, the example of the floods, when they started looking in the 50s, it was very widespread, and there wasn't much use in, even from their opinion, in looking to challenge. But I do think that Montgomery County has a pretty decent history as far as being a progressive place. Montgomery County is one of these areas that where individuals worked to desegregate schools with all deliberate speed, and did not take that as a wink to take all the time you wanted. You had individuals such as the Kramer family and so forth who were active in county government and county education. So I do believe that Montgomery County was a little bit ahead of most, but it's probably different in terms of, there's a different story for each neighborhood and a different story for each region of the county, I'm sure.
And so a question here from Jan. Were the families getting mortgages from which types of lenders? Were they using FHA loans, or anything you can share about the challenges they faced in getting financing?
Well, the floods had a problem getting financing, and they had to end up going through their church. Even though he mentioned his salary around that time, around 1960, he was making around $7,000 a year, which sounded like a really good salary for then. Doesn't sound like anything now, but I think for then that was an excellent salary. But they were not able to get a loan through any other means but their church. The Klughs were able to assume the loan that was already on the house. We didn't discuss the loan thing with Mr. Colton, and the loans was not something I went into on a broad level. I was looking at the specific experiences of these three families. I'm sure loans have always been a challenge. Even more recently in the news, you've had a situation where an individual's been fighting against the undervaluation of their home by home appraisers. It was in the news, a situation, I believe, in California, just within the past 2 weeks. A Black family had their home appraised after they had put in around $400,000 worth of improvements into the house. And the home was appraised, but for far less than they thought it should be. So they got together with a friend of theirs who was white and had that person actually come to the house and put up pictures all around the house of their family, just so it will make it look like the person who lived in the house was this white person. And lo and behold, the home appraised for over $300,000 more than when the appraiser came and it was an identifiably Black family that was in the house. Some of these things are hard because you don't know. Sometimes you don't know, you don't compare notes about the prices for permits a lot of times with people, or the prices for appraisals. So it's kind of hard to tell, and it's kind of hard to tell whether or not discrimination has occurred in some cases.
So I just want to share, we have a couple of folks who have offered some information that I'll share. Debbie Goldberg says, great presentation. In case folks are wondering, suburban Maryland fair housing doesn't exist anymore, but there is a fair housing organization that covers the metro area, including Montgomery County. It's called the Equal Rights Center, and fair housing organizations still use testing as a way to determine whether discrimination is occurring in housing, sales, and rentals, and are always looking for people to be testers. And so when we send out information after this, we can share some of that. Melissa Richards says, thank you for this presentation. I'm a school teacher, 39 years, who worked at Paint Branch, Northwood, Cloverly Elementary School, and Springbrook for most of my life. I grew up in Rockville, which has an interesting history. I now live in Quaint Acres for more, I've now lived in Quaint Acres for more than 30 years and have been dismayed at the discrimination in my neighborhood, Blake instead of Springbrook. I wish you the best and thank you for your presentation. Matt Logan, the executive director of Montgomery County History, the Historical Society, says that he looks forward to working with you to house these oral histories and other documents. Here we have another question from John. Did you interview any of the Black families that preceded the development of Tamarack Triangle and who may have attended the Black school that was later used as a bus depot and I believe has since been restored?
I did interview several individuals who were part of that original Smithville community. And just to understand what the general rhythm of life was for individuals who grew up there. The oldest individual I interviewed, unfortunately passed away maybe 10 years ago now, Miss Clara Smith. I think she might have been a granddaughter of George Smith. She grew up in the community, was a child in the community back in the 1920s. I was able to interview people who taught at the school and who went to the Smithville school. When I was growing up, that building was used as a bus depot, which was good because at least it was preserved, it wasn't knocked down. And so when Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity was looking for a place to use for their meetings and so forth, they knew of this particular facility that the county, I believe at the time, was looking to get rid of, and they made a deal with the county that they would preserve this building. So the county gave them a discount rate to purchase the building with the understanding that they would put in a few $100,000 of work and sweat equity to actually preserve the building. And that's what's occurred. And it's been utilized as a meeting facility. Individuals can rent this facility as a meeting facility now for at least 15 or so years. It's been utilized. And I believe there's a history day that happens once or twice a year in Montgomery County. And this is part of the facilities that opens up for individuals who are coming to tour and learn about the history of the community. It was interesting to learn about Smithville and just things like the fact that African-American enclaves generally had their own baseball teams. And so they would play baseball against each other. Like where Colesville Estates is now, where a portion of that is now, was actually where the gentleman pointed out that's where they had their baseball field. And learning about the work that people did to build the school. Individuals in the community donated the land for the school. They actually came out and worked to help build it and donated materials and raised money to fund the school, because the Rosenwald Fund did not build schools hands down. The Rosenwald Fund was like a matching funds type program. So a community could apply to the Rosenwald Fund to have some seed money to build the school. And as part of that, the community had to reach an agreement with the county that the county would support the school once the school was built. But the Rosenwald Fund would put up about 1/3 of the money necessary for the school. So anywhere there's a Rosenwald school, that is a legacy of a strong community that existed there to make that school happen, because the Rosenwald Fund did not provide even half the money or any of the land to build that school.
And so, Dr. Klugh, I think we have one, maybe two, one final question here. From Jean, do you have any suggestions as to how we can integrate some of our neighborhoods here in Silver Spring today?
I'm not too far away. I live in Columbia, which has its own pretty amazing story of being constructed as an integrated community. The legacy of James Rouse and his efforts to make sure that people had a choice and that he built a community that would be lasting, and been relatively successful in that effort. You know, Montgomery County, to me, I really have not lived in Montgomery County for since the 90s. And I'm Baltimore specific right now these days because I'm working in Baltimore. I see Montgomery, I have to look at the demographics, but I see Montgomery County as a fairly integrated place. So I guess currently I'd be curious to learn more about what are the issues in play in Montgomery County. Is it more based in what people can afford, or are there, I see Montgomery County as one of the more integrated communities in this country. I would have questions for that questioner to learn more about the situation.
Well, so that really is going to conclude our Q&A time. Dr. Klugh, I believe you offered to share your email with folks. So if people do want to get in touch with you, so if you can put your email in the chat, and then we'll also share your email with the sort of follow-up resources. And I see that Jane Lyon actually sent me a message saying that her organization did an event on housing, land use, and racism in Montgomery County, and people can find the historical materials, and she gives me a link, and we will share that link out. So I am going to hand things over to Yesenia to close us up.
Okay.
Yeah, so thank you everybody for joining us tonight. It's really important. This was a presentation in a historical context to understand that these things are still showing up today. We need to stay vigilant of how racism is continuing to show up in housing and other institutions. As it relates to housing, right now in Montgomery County, as many of you all know, we have an affordable housing crisis and also an eviction crisis with COVID. So we really encourage you to follow the work of the Coalition for Smarter Growth, the Renters Alliance, and the Montgomery Housing Alliance to stay informed against fighting some of these inequities and discrimination. I also want to give you guys some information on how to stay connected to learning and activism within Impacts Silver Spring. We have the Montgomery County Racial Equity Network, known as MORE. This is a coalition of local community activists, grassroots organizations, and nonprofits working to eliminate racial disparities in Montgomery County, specifically ensuring the successful implementation of the Racial Equity and Social Justice Act by the County Council. And at an individual level, we also have the Weaver Learning Program, the Weaver Learning Lab. And this is a space where it's intentional of being a diverse group that takes the time to really slow down and understand the inner work needed for the outer transformation as we're working to eliminate racism, really take a holistic approach in understanding your own activism. And we provide you with the framework to help you be more effective. So I will put both links in the chat. Thank you for joining us this evening. Again, thank you to Dr. Klugh. And we will follow up with you all with an email with resources that were shared and whatever else we told them, Lanita. I'm sure there's probably like a lot of stuff we're going to organize from the chat. So we just appreciate you all being with us tonight. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you again, Dr. Klugh.
Bye.
Very much. I just one last thing I just wanted to say is I wanted to mention it's not lost on me. I'm an older guy now, I'm 47, but it's not lost on me that I'm the first generation in my lineage who was able to go home shopping and not have discrimination be the paramount thing. And that's not lost on me. This is relatively new in terms of the openness as a society, and we need to work to preserve it and advance it. So thank you.